Angela, a pregnant single mother, takes the job of caring for Daniel, the paralyzed son of a millionaire. What seemed to be an opportunity for a better life soon becomes a nightmare when Angela discovers a dark secret involving not only Daniel, but herself. The rain was beating hard against the windows of the small apartment, and the sound of the drops was Angela's only companion on that lonely early evening. With her belly already visibly growing and her hands tired from so many endless shifts, she looked once more into the small room of her son, Josh. The boy, only 6 years old, suffered from a rare condition that left him unable to move his legs or make voluntary movements. Since the diagnosis, Angela had not stopped fighting, always finding new jobs to ensure stability in her son's life. But with the pregnancy, things had become even more complicated. Then the offer came. A millionaire, a wealthy and well-off man in Manhattan, needed a caregiver for his son, Daniel. Daniel, it turned out, was also in a desperate situation, a car accident that had left him paralyzed from the neck down. The offer seemed like a gift, a high-paying job that would solve her financial problems for a while. Angela hesitated for a moment, but the opportunity was too tempting. And to be honest, she needed something to relieve the pressures of everyday life. She accepted the job. The millionaire's home was in an upscale neighborhood of the city, in a huge mansion, a stark contrast to the modest life she and Josh led. On her first day at work, Angela was introduced to Daniel. He was a young man of about 25, with intense eyes and a look of someone who seemed lost, distant, in a world that no longer made sense to him. His voice was hoarse and slurred, but there was a sharp intelligence behind his words, something that made him captivating. However, his physical condition confined him to a wheelchair, and he depended on the help of others to survive. Angela soon got used to the routine of the house. The work was not easy. She helped him with his meals, bathed him, and spent the afternoons talking to him so that the silence would not be even more oppressive. But there was something unsettling about the mansion, a feeling that something wasn't right, something she couldn't immediately put her finger on. The millionaire, Mr. Montgomery, was an absent presence, often traveling on business, leaving Angela with Daniel. The two developed a routine, with Angela doing her best to provide some comfort to the young man. But as time passed, something began to change. She noticed Daniel's behavior, which seemed increasingly eccentric, far from his patient status. His gaze, which had previously seemed lost, now had something more disturbing. It was as if the mansion was full of secrets, something in the shadows that Angela could not understand. And then, that afternoon, Angela arrived at work early, unannounced. What she saw left her speechless. The sound of the door opening made Daniel look at her, and his blank eyes were fixed on something Angela didn't understand. She looked around, her body freezing in place. What she found was a messy room, with objects scattered everywhere. But the most shocking thing was seeing the large computer screen turned on, with disturbing images being displayed. Angela blinked, trying to understand, but the scene before her was clearly beyond her comprehension. Daniel, standing in his chair, breathing heavily and nervously, seemed unconcerned by her presence. His expression had changed, something darker taking over his face. He didn't seem like the same polite, intelligent man she had known in those first few weeks. Angela took a hesitant step toward the computer and saw what was being projected on the screen. Disturbing scenes and a strange game. It was a game of power, of control, and the screen showed people suffering, as if she were watching a macabre experiment. She could not believe what she was seeing. Angela's mind began to race. She knew Daniel had distanced himself, but she never imagined he could be involved in something so horrible. The shock of seeing this revelation made her stomach hurt even more, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. "Daniel, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer right away, just looked at her with a cold smile as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said finally, in a lower tone, almost as if he wanted to apologize. Silence hung in the room for a long moment, and Angela didn't know how to react. What did she do now? What did this mean for her life, for her son's future, and for the trust she had placed in this house? What she didn't know at that moment was that this was just the tip of the iceberg, and what was behind the mask of a paralyzed, rich young man was much scarier than she could ever imagine. Angela slowly stepped away from the computer, the weight of the revelation still weighing on her. She felt a growing nausea, Not just because of what she had seen, but because of the feeling that she was on very dangerous ground. Montgomery's home, with its spacious rooms and lush gardens, which had once seemed like a safe haven, now became a maze of uncertainty and fear. The luxury around her no longer calmed her, but made her anxious, as if the walls of the mansion had ears, as if the paintings on the wall were watching. Daniel's gaze was cold, calculating, as if he knew she had discovered something she should never have seen. But, contrary to what she expected, he did not confront her. There was a disturbing calm about him, a confidence that Angela did not understand. He remained there, motionless, as if the scene he himself was watching was just another pastime, something trivial. Angela took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts, but the words would not come out of her mouth. "Daniel," she began hesitantly. "Why, this?" He didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the screen, as if he were observing something that was more important than everything else around him. The tension in the air intensified, as if the mansion had stopped breathing for a moment. "I'm an experiment, Angela," he said finally, his tone almost cold. "The only thing left for me to do is observe, experiment, control." Angela didn't know what to say. What did he mean by experiment? He was a man trapped in his own body, but at the same time, there he was, like an enigmatic figure, trying to dominate everything around him, even her. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice shaking. "You're in a wheelchair. How can you be an experiment? You think being paralyzed means you're immune? The mind has no limitations, Angela," Daniel said with a smile. "I'm the product of a system, of a game that people don't want you to see. Things are controlled by those at the top. I was designed for this." Angela felt her heart race. What he was saying didn't make sense. He seemed to have a distorted understanding of what was happening in the world, but at the same time she knew that his words weren't just delusions. There was something real behind this madness, something dark, something that she didn't fully understand. Before she could ask more, the door creaked open. Mr. Montgomery, the millionaire she had only glimpsed, entered the room. He was a tall, thin, middle-aged man with a stern countenance. His calculating gaze quickly settled on Angela, and she felt a strange sense of being watched. "Angela," he said with a smile that didn't touch his eyes, "I see you found my son's entertainment." Angela didn't know what to say. What should she do? Reveal what he had seen, trying to escape from what was happening? But Mr. Montgomery's gaze kept her from moving, and his presence, cold and distant, seemed to fill the entire room. "Daniel," Mr. Montgomery said, turning to his son. "Time to stop this." But Daniel didn't move. He was still staring at the screen, as if in a trance. The man, visibly uncomfortable, walked over and pressed a button on the computer screen, stopping the game. But Angela knew that this was just the surface of something much bigger, something they didn't want her to know about. "You understand, don't you, Angela?" Mr. Montgomery asked, stepping closer. "What's happening here isn't about his condition. It never was." Angela stepped back a little, trying to understand what was happening. Something was very wrong, much more than she imagined. She looked at Daniel, who was now watching her with empty eyes but still with an enigmatic smile. She no longer knew who to trust, or what was real and what wasn't. The mansion felt more like a prison than a refuge, and she was beginning to feel like her very life was at stake. I need to leave," she said finally, trying to remain calm. But before she could move, Mr. Montgomery placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "You can't leave, Angela," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're already inside. There's no way out." The air in the mansion felt thick, charged with a tension that Angela could not shake. Mr. Montgomery, with his oppressive presence, was still beside her, his hand firm on her shoulder as if escape were impossible. Angela felt the weight of the situation settle over her, heavier than any job, more suffocating than the responsibility of caring for her son. The opulent surroundings around her no longer felt welcoming, but hostile, as if the walls of the mansion were closing in on her. "Do you think you can leave now?" Mr. Montgomery's voice cut through the silence, implacable. "You already know more than you should, Angela." She looked at him, trying to find some way to escape, but his eyes were cold and calculating. Angela didn't understand what he really wanted. Was it just power? Control? Or was there something darker that she couldn't see yet? But what else could she do but continue with her routine and try to understand what was happening? With his hand still pressed on her shoulder, he forced her to sit at the nearby table. "Now you will hear what I have to say," he said, and his tone left no room for refusal. Angela, tense, took a deep breath. She knew there was nothing she could do at that moment but listen. Fear was taking over her, but a part of her felt that she needed to understand what was really happening there. She couldn't let fear paralyze her like it had done with Daniel. The millionaire sat across from her, adjusting his tie as if he were in a business meeting. His posture, impeccable and controlled, was a reflection of the world he represented. But something in his expression made it clear that deep down he was always ahead, manipulating every piece on the board. "You think this is about my son, don't you?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with veiled threat. "But the truth is much more complicated. What Daniel is living, what you see of him every day, is just a facade, an experiment, a distraction." Angela felt a chill run down her spine. "Experiment? What are you saying?" He smiled faintly, a cold, emotionless smile. "My son has been chosen for a special project, a test of mental endurance. He was never just a casualty, Angela. He is a crucial piece in something bigger." Angela's heart pounded. "You are saying that he was chosen for this?" "Yes," he replied with a tone of affirmation. "And it's not just that. I, as your father, am at the center of a movement much more complex than you can imagine. Daniel has been conditioned since the accident to become part of something bigger. He is an experiment, a part of a web of control and manipulation." Angela tried to digest those words, but her mind was in tatters. "Control and manipulation? You're talking about a game? That thing he was watching? It's not just a game, Angela. It's more than that. It's preparation for a new world, where minds can be controlled, shaped as desired. Daniel, my company, you, we're all connected to this. This game, as you call it, is a simulation of how we can alter human behavior." Angela shook her head, trying to comprehend. "That's insane. You're saying he's being manipulated, and that you're behind it?" "Yes, Angela, but not just him. We are all pawns in this great game. We were all designed to obey, to be part of a system that controls what we think, what we feel, what we do. And you were an essential piece." Angela fell silent, startled by what she had just heard. She had been drawn into this game without realizing it. The job she had accepted, the care she had taken for Daniel, it was all part of a bigger plan, something she had no idea how it worked. "I was never a prank," she said, trying to hide the panic in her voice. "I just wanted to help, to give my son a better future. You thought you were making a choice, Angela, but the choices were made for you a long time ago. And now you're in. There's no way out." Angela's heart raced, and she felt the reality of what was happening sink in coldly and relentlessly. The mansion wasn't just a workplace. It was a prison. Her life, in a way, was already tied to this game of manipulation. Daniel, the young man she cared for, wasn't a victim, as she had imagined. He was the center of it all, the key to even greater control. Angela stood up abruptly, her legs shaking. "I won't be a part of this. I won't let this happen." But Mr. Montgomery only watched her with a distant look, as if he knew her resistance was futile. "Do you think you can pull this off, Angela? You've never been out. The world you live in is just one part of this grand experiment. The question is, will you adapt? Or will you be discarded like all the other pieces?" Angela felt a lump in her throat. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. She couldn't trust Daniel or Mr. Montgomery. The mansion was a prison, and she was inside it. But still, she wasn't willing to succumb to their control. Angela didn't know who to trust anymore, but there was something inside her that told her she couldn't give up. The conversation with Mr. Montgomery had been a shock, but also an awakening. She now had a mission. It was no longer just about her, and not just about work, but about protecting her son, Josh, and also finding a way to escape this huge, suffocating web. She had lived her entire life seeking security, caring for Josh, trying to maintain a financial stability that would keep them out of poverty. Now, with her secret out in the open, Angela found herself facing something much bigger than she could have imagined. What she didn't know, however, was that her struggle was far from just with Mr. Montgomery and Daniel. The complications went far beyond that. As Mr. Montgomery attempted to manipulate her reality, Angela became aware of something else. something even more disturbing. She was not just up against a powerful man, but a web of self-interest and manipulation that stretched across society. Her position as Daniel's caretaker had unwittingly placed her in the middle of something larger. This quest for mind control and manipulation was not an isolated occurrence. She would soon discover that influential people around the world were participating in this network, either actively or passively, keeping this dirty game going. But Angela's battle wasn't just against the powerful men behind this scheme. She also found herself in a profound moral dilemma. As she tried to figure out a way to escape and protect her son, something inside her began to question Daniel's very nature. What had seemed like a victim was now revealing a more sinister side. He knew much more than he let on, and something inside Angela began to change. She realized that he was no longer the man she thought he was, but someone different. Someone so out of control that he now felt completely immune to his own actions. The next night, Angela was called in for a new shift. She knew the game was escalating, and she needed to figure out what was really going on with Daniel, what he was really doing with his time. When she arrived, something was different. The atmosphere in the house was heavier, and a sense of paranoia was consuming her. She knew there was more hidden there. It was then that, as she approached Daniel's room, she heard a whisper coming from inside. She stopped, listening, and listened again. It was Daniel speaking in a low, barely audible voice. He was talking to someone, but who? Without making a sound, Angela approached the half-open door and looked inside. What she saw took her breath away. Daniel was sitting in the wheelchair, but he wasn't alone. There was someone else there, a shadowy, indistinct figure with a hood over his face. They were talking quickly as if the conversation was urgent, and Daniel's tone was far from the calm, calculating one she was familiar with. He was tense, worried, as if he were trying to hide something. Angela couldn't hear everything, but she could hear enough to understand that Daniel wasn't just stuck in a wheelchair. He was playing a more dangerous game than she had imagined. I can't follow the rules anymore, you know," Daniel said, his voice lower. "They're starting to notice that I'm changing. They know that manipulation isn't working anymore." "You have no choice," the hooded figure's low voice replied. "If you try to leave, we will all be destroyed. Don't be naive. Do as you were intended, complete your mission." Angela felt a chill run down her spine. The conversation didn't make sense. She knew there was something more going on, something she couldn't fully understand. But now she knew Daniel's game was changing. He was no longer a victim. He had become an active player, someone who held power that shouldn't be wasted. Before she could take a step away and out of Daniel's reach, the hooded figure suddenly turned around, and Angela had only a split second to hide behind the door. She was panting, feeling panic take over her body. The fear of being discovered, of being drawn deeper into this macabre game, was overwhelming. What else could she do? She had no control over anything anymore. Back at home, her heart racing and her mind buzzing with new information, Angela knew that the situation was beyond her comprehension. Mr. Montgomery, Daniel, and those behind this system were on a level she could not reach. But there was something in her determination, something that kept her fighting even when the odds seemed to be running out. She needed to get out. She needed to get her son out of this web. But to do that, she needed more than courage. She needed to understand how to defeat this web without being crushed by it. Angela couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's words, or the hooded figure he was talking to. That midnight conversation in the Montgomery house had sent her mind spinning for answers. She had believed for so long that the problem was only Daniel and Mr. Montgomery's control over him, but now the pieces began to fit together in a way she couldn't ignore. What did she really know about this web of manipulation? What did Daniel mean by completing his mission? The next few days were like a growing nightmare. Angela continued to care for Daniel, but with each passing moment she felt a heavier weight on her shoulders. She felt there was something else going on, something even deeper, that she needed to understand so she could finally make a choice. Fight or flight. She tried to be discreet in her investigations. She watched Daniel more closely, noting every movement, every word. There was something different about him. He seemed more aware, more alert, as if he were preparing for something big. The quiet moments between them, those few minutes when she could rest, were becoming shorter. Angela knew she couldn't stay here much longer. Something was about to happen. It was during a particularly sultry afternoon, when Mr. Montgomery was not home, that Angela decided to investigate further. She snuck through the mansion, trying to access Daniel's files, his emails, any clue she could find. She knew the answer was hidden somewhere, but what she didn't know was how close she was to discovering something that would change her life forever. Upon accessing Daniel's computer, Angela didn't expect to find anything other than more vague clues. But upon opening an encrypted folder, she found a document that made her stop in her tracks. The title was clear: Project Aurora, Mind Control. She began to read, the words crashing into her mind, unraveling into a truth she had never imagined. The Aurora Project was a massive experiment, a secret project developed by a network of powerful companies and individuals, including Mr. Montgomery himself. The goal was simple but disturbing: to control human minds, to manipulate decisions, emotions, and, most of all, to create an army of people who would follow orders without question. Daniel was not a victim of the accident. He had been chosen to be the key to this experiment. He had been manipulated from the beginning, with the promise of being part of something bigger. But the worst was yet to come. The document revealed that Angela had not been randomly chosen to care for Daniel. She had been part of the plan from the beginning. She had been inserted into his life to observe, monitor, and ultimately instill in Daniel a sense of loyalty and control. She had been unwittingly manipulated into becoming a pawn in this cruel game. The document contained details about how the manipulation was done, through psychological stimuli, controlled experiments, and the gradual alteration of the perception of reality. Angela's feelings, her care, and interactions with Daniel were part of the process. She had, without realizing it, been a key player in Daniel's reprogramming. He wasn't the only one being manipulated. She was also part of a much larger illusion. What perplexed her most was the end of the document. The final phase of Project Aurora will be full integration. Once the transformation is complete, all those involved must be eliminated to avoid public exposure. Angela felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. She was trapped. Not just Daniel, but herself. Mr. Montgomery didn't just want to control people's minds, he wanted to destroy them when the job was done. She stood up abruptly, feeling panic begin to take over her body. But as she took a step back, she felt something cold on her neck. The sensation of being watched. The shallow breathing. She turned, and there was Daniel, standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her, expressionless. "You figured it out, didn't you?" Daniel said with disturbing calm. Angela couldn't hide her shock. She backed away slowly, trying not to show the panic that was taking hold of her. He knew. He had known all along. Are you part of this?" she managed to ask, her voice hoarse and shaky. Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was a grim smile of someone who had already made a choice. "I was never a victim, Angela. I was the key. I am the future. And you're just a piece, like everyone else." Angela felt the weight of his words, but something inside her flared. The anger, the desperation, the desire to escape, and most of all, the need to protect her son, Josh. She couldn't let that be the end. She looked at Daniel, feeling the weight of his actions, his words. What he had said hadn't surprised her, but now it all seemed clearer. Daniel's choice had been made. He had given himself over to the system, but she hadn't. She wouldn't let the cycle repeat itself. "I will not be your plaything, Daniel," she said firmly, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "I will destroy this. I will end it all." He just watched her, the smile on his face growing wider. "Try, Angela, but you'll find that sometimes there's no escape." Angela could barely breathe. Daniel's words echoed in her mind like a warning bell, announcing impending danger. She felt as if she were in the eye of a storm, with the cold, relentless wind of manipulation and control pushing her in a direction with no way out. Everything she believed to be true, everything she thought she knew about herself, was crumbling around her. But the worst part wasn't that Daniel was involved in the scheme. The worst part was knowing that she had been part of it too, without realizing it. The role of caregiver she had assumed for Daniel was nothing more than a trap in disguise. She had been lured into this web, manipulated in such a subtle way that she hadn't even realized it. Now, faced with the full truth, she didn't know what to do. How could she ever trust anything or anyone again? She looked back at Daniel, who still stood in the doorway, like a shadow following her every step. His gaze was cold, almost indifferent, but there was something there, something that seemed to say, "Now you know. Now the game is over." Angela tried to stay calm, taking deep breaths to stave off the rising panic in her chest. "You can't run from this, Angela," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "You've always been a part of this. There's no going back now." But Angela knew she couldn't just accept those words. There was no choice left. She had been drawn into this game, and she couldn't allow herself to be another pawn. The most important thing now was to figure out what she could do to break the system, to free not only herself, but also her son Josh, who she knew was still in danger, even though he was far away from that house. She tried to gather her thoughts. The first thing she had to do was get out of there. She could no longer remain a puppet in the hands of Montgomery, Daniel, or anyone else involved in this macabre project. But leaving meant facing an enemy far more powerful than she had imagined. And there was something Angela didn't know. Mr. Montgomery had already anticipated her reaction. As Angela tried to leave the office, the phone rang. She hesitated for a moment but answered it. Mr. Montgomery's cool, controlled voice came from the other end. "Angela, I know you've discovered the truth," he said with frightening calm. "And I know you're thinking about running away. But before you make any decisions, I need you to understand one thing. You've never been out of this game. You've always been a key player. And now the consequences of your choice are going to be severe." Those words pierced his mind like a sharp blade. She pushed away from the table, her body trembling. He knew what she was thinking. He had always known. "What are you going to do to me?" she asked, her voice filled with anger and fear. "I'm not going to do anything to you, Angela. The choice is yours. You can remain part of the system or, if you prefer, be discarded. But if you decide to leave, it won't be just you who will suffer the consequences. Your son will be affected too." Angela stood still for a moment, frozen by the veiled threat. She knew he wasn't lying. The power he held over her and her life was enormous. The fear of losing Josh hit her hard like a tidal wave. But there was something else there. The need to fight, to not give in to Montgomery's control. She had to find a way to turn this around, to save her son and herself before it was too late. She hung up the phone and stepped away from the table. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out how to destroy the empire of manipulation Montgomery had created. The game was at a tipping point and the rules had changed. Angela now knew what she had to do, even if it was difficult, even if it was dangerous. She needed to find the source. She needed to find where Montgomery was controlling everything and shut him down once and for all. But there was one problem. She didn't know how much Daniel was involved in this process. He, who had once seemed so easily manipulated, now seemed more like an ally than a victim. He was a vital part of the system, not just a pawn. Angela looked at him, still standing in the doorway, her eyes piercing and empty. "Daniel, you don't understand," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to destroy this. I'm going to take down this network no matter what it takes." He stared at her for a long moment, without response. Then he simply said, "I am not your enemy, Angela. The enemy is right in front of you, and you do not yet know how to face him." Those words echoed in her mind, and Angela felt even more confused. What did he mean by that? Was he referring to Montgomery or something else? She wasn't sure, but something was clearly going on, something she didn't yet fully understand. She needed a way to take action. With no more time to waste, Angela made a decision. She couldn't keep waiting for answers from Daniel or Montgomery. It was time to do something on her own, to risk everything and destroy the system from the inside out. But as she prepared to make her decision, she knew her and Josh's future was about to change forever. The final confrontation was approaching, and she could no longer hesitate. Now or never. Angela was at the point of no return. There was no more room for hesitation, for uncertainty. Mr. Montgomery had laid all his cards on the table, and now she had to make her final move. She had discovered the true nature of the Aurora Project, the web of manipulation that had ensnared Daniel, the millionaire, and her own life. She knew that the only way to save herself and her son was to destroy the system from within, but the price would be high, much higher than she had imagined. She had decided to act on her own, no longer waiting for answers from Daniel or Montgomery. The key was now in the heart of the mansion, the center of control. Angela knew that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't destroy the system without facing the man who orchestrated it all. But there was one obstacle: Daniel. He was still trapped in that cycle of manipulation, and there was something else about him that she couldn't fully understand. What did he want? What did he know? Was he truly on her side? Or was he just another pawn in a game where he controlled the rules? Tension built with every step she took. When Daniel walked into the room, it felt like time had stopped. He no longer spoke in that calculating tone, nor did he seem so distant and cold. He was silent, his eyes watching her intently. "You're going to try, aren't you?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with disdain. Angela didn't hesitate. "I'm going to destroy all of this, Daniel. I can't stay here trapped anymore. You need to understand that too." Daniel was silent, but something changed in his gaze. He seemed more aware than ever, as if he knew the game was coming to an end. He looked at her with an expression that was both desolate and defiant. "You don't understand, Angela. You think you can destroy this, but the control isn't just in here, it's everywhere." Angela swallowed. He was right. She knew it, but she couldn't accept it. There was a part of her that believed that if she could destroy the core, the rest would fall apart. But Daniel, with his dark gaze, knew something she didn't. He was more involved than she realized. He wasn't a mere pawn in this game, he was the key, and perhaps the key to the end. But she had no choice. She couldn't back down now. She couldn't let the web that ruled everything take over her life. Josh's future. He was her priority. She only had one chance, and it would take courage to take the next step. She began walking towards Mr. Montgomery's office. The doors of the mansion seemed more menacing than ever. Every hallway, every window was as if it was watching her actions, waiting for her to make the slightest mistake. When she finally reached the Millionaire's office, something in the air felt different. She could feel his presence as if he were waiting. The fear, the dread was there, but Angela also felt something else. Anger. The office door opened with a low creak. Mr. Montgomery sat at the table, as always, his eagle eyes watching her. "Angela, you don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice calm and full of disdain. "You think you can stop what's already been set in motion, but you can't. You've never been free. You've always been in control. You just didn't know it." Angela didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. She was about to do the unthinkable, but there was no turning back now. "I know what you did, Montgomery. I know what's going on here, and you're going to pay for it." His gaze remained impassive, almost disinterested. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie with a careful gesture. "You have no idea what you're talking about. The Aurora project is bigger than you can comprehend. I'm just a piece of it, just like you." Angela stepped forward. "I'm not your piece, Montgomery. Not anymore." With that, she advanced toward the desk, where a series of controls and computers were laid out. She knew that if she could gain access to the central system, she could override the control. But Montgomery was not about to let her off easily. He pressed a button on the desk, and immediately the lights in the room went out. A sense of panic washed over her. The mansion felt alive. Every room, every hallway filled with a menacing presence. She knew he had activated some form of security. "You think you can destroy this? You're wrong," he said, his voice echoing in the darkness. "This project isn't just about me, it's about the world order. You don't even come close to understanding what's at stake." Angela, her mind in a whirlwind of thoughts, did not hesitate. She turned and ran to the mainframe. The security system had been activated, but she knew how to access it. The code, which she had seen in one of the classified documents, was now engraved in her mind. She typed quickly, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. When the screen flashed and she saw the system begin to crumble before her eyes, something inside her flared. This was the victory she so desperately needed. She was destroying the network, but the price would be high. Daniel, who had been watching the scene with an impassive expression, was now moving toward her, his eyes empty. "You can't do this," he said, a last attempt to stop what was happening. "I'm the key. There's no turning back now." But Angela had already taken the final step. The system began to crumble, and Montgomery's last words were lost in the darkness. Everything around her was disintegrating, but there was something more important to Angela than the destruction of the empire of control. It was Josh's future, and she had done the unthinkable. She had broken the chains. Silence filled the mansion. When the central system finally shut down, the computer screen went dark, and the lights slowly came back on. Angela, her hands still shaking, watched the screen, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The network that had controlled her actions, the manipulation she and so many others had experienced, was finally falling apart. But what was left now? The mansion, once a playground for control and manipulation, lay in ruins. Project Aurora had been dismantled, but the truth was that Angela's fight had only just begun. She knew that as much as she had destroyed the system, there was much more to come. The battle was not just against Mr. Montgomery and the empire he represented. The real fight would be against the legacy of manipulation that had permeated their lives. She looked at Daniel, who was still there, standing in the doorway of the office. His eyes were empty, but there was something else, something that resembled a deep sadness, as if he knew that despite everything, he was lost. He was no longer the man Angela had known, no longer a simple pawn. He had been shaped in ways she could barely understand. "You hate me now, don't you?" Daniel asked, his voice weak but filled with palpable melancholy. Angela felt a tightness in her chest, but her anger and pain didn't dissipate. "I don't know what to do with you, Daniel. I don't know who you are anymore." He didn't answer, just lowered his head, as if accepting the blame she now placed on him. He wasn't just an accomplice. He was a victim too. But his pain, what he had become, wouldn't be something easy to forgive. Not for Angela. She walked away, not looking back. She couldn't allow herself to get lost in those empty eyes any longer. She had a mission. Her mission was her son. He needed her now more than ever. When Angela finally reached the mansion's door, she felt a cool breeze caress her face. It was as if the world outside was completely different from the one she was leaving behind. She knew that when she left that house, she would no longer be trapped. Freedom, even if difficult to achieve, was within her reach. But there was something that bothered her. What would come next? What would happen to Daniel and to everyone else involved in the manipulation? She knew that the fight against control would not end there. The future seemed uncertain, and the fear of being hunted still haunted her. But as she looked up at the night sky, Angela felt she had done what needed to be done. She had broken the chains. Now she could begin to rebuild her life, with her son, away from the shadow of control that had marked her existence. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She would no longer be a puppet. She would choose her own path. Months had passed since the fall of the mansion. Angela and Josh had found a new beginning in a distant place far from the shadows of their past. Life was not easy, but there was a semblance of peace she had not felt in years. However, she knew that the battle against control was never ending. In her new life, she took control of her destiny with determination, but she always wondered, were they truly free? Or had the system simply adapted? The fear was still present, but Angela was now prepared for any challenge that came her way. Angela's journey reminds us of the strength we can find within ourselves, even when circumstances seem to imprison us. Her story is a reflection on the limits of control, human resilience, and the importance of fighting for our freedom, no matter how difficult it may be. Are you struggling with your own struggles? Are you willing to challenge the systems that try to control your life? Don't let fear or doubt hold you back. Sometimes the real fight is for our own freedom, and that's where we find our true strength.